You know who always has the super strong soldiers and crazy armor that's either high-tech or blessed by the gods? The real pieces of work of the universe, that's who. In Warhammer Fantasy, it was Chaos who had the, Warriors of Chaos. Look at them. Crazy Baroque armor, blessed by the gods, while their main enemies have pike and shot. That's hardly fair. Or the Empire in Star Wars. You got the rebels in business casual attire with a funky helmet. Meanwhile, the Empire has stormtroopers, which, while the armor is presumably made out of used chewing gum, still fit the bill. And it's more of the same in 40k, because everyone is evil in that godforsaken universe. I'm sorry, Space Marine fans, but your favorite chapter is almost certainly not a force for good, just lesser shades of dickhead. Vulcan torched an Eldar child, remember. If the good guys do have this kind of thing, then it'll be in far fewer supply than the bad guys. The Spartans had power armor and no one else, half the Covenant had some rough equivalent. Well, you know what? If there's one thing I can truthfully thank Age of Sigmar for, it's fixing this issue. Finally, the good guys have their own armored, basically immortal killing machines that throw into the fray. So do you like massive, bulky heroes of legend throwing down against massive, bulky villains of legend, all the while a power metal album cover for the fate of reality is happening in the background? Then why don't we see if the Stormcast Eternals are the faction for you? Stormcast Eternals are what happens when Sigmar finally had enough of Chaos hogging all the fantasy power armor and said he was done fucking around. See, Neoldi fantasy lore was just regular dudes against literal demons of hell and worse, and they always eventually came out on top, except for that one time they didn't and the world blew up. But Sigmar knows that everyone makes mistakes and figured he'd give the regular folks of the world another try. And for the longest time in Age of Sigmar's backstory, it worked. With every god working together, Chaos couldn't do jack. And even when it started invading, the average Joes and Jills of the world fought it tooth and nail. But then all the other gods like Tyrion and Gork and or Mork started pissing off to do their own thing, and Sigmar eventually lost that war along with everyone else. He realized that despite his godly powers and abilities, he couldn't handle chaos on his own with just an army of regular people. So he closed shut the doors for an entire eighth of reality, sat in his room for a few hundred and or thousand of years, and when he came out, he had his own super soldiers to fight with. They were the Stormcast Eternals, his finest warriors who shall know no fear. Wait, no, that's someone else. Each Stormcast is formed from a hero who's about to die in a glorious stand against chaos. The neat thing is it isn't necessarily just great warriors. The only real qualification is if you went above and beyond the call of duty while resisting chaos. A noblewoman who allowed hundreds of refugees into her realm before sacrificing herself in a distraction while they escaped could become Stormcast Eternal. A baker supplying soldiers until the last wall fell could become one as well. Hell, it's possible other species than humans could become Stormcast, though I don't believe that one's been officially shown yet. With these heroes turned superheroes, Sigmar pushed back chaos on all fronts, and as they reconquered the mortal realms, the normal citizens made sure to secure what the Stormcast had won. Finally, the good guys had their own ace in the hole, other than the plot armor that comes with being the plucky underdogs against forces beyond our comprehension. So, with the background said and done, what makes them an attractive army from a lore standpoint? Well, like I said in the intro, if you want the forces of good to be souped up heroes blessed by an angry god, look no further. That sort of vibe is generally reserved for the assholes, so now you can play the morally correct side of the fight dressed in a smart car's worth of metal. In a universe where historically the good guys were always in some way outmatched, it's nice to see the Stormcast even things up a bit. More than just the power armor though, the Stormcast are the first good guy faction in Warhammer that doesn't need to fear death and slowly bleeding away via attrition, which is pretty sick. See, when they die, Sigmar just goes nah and stuffs their soul back in a new body before telling them to get back out there, champ. So you never need to feel like you're part of the losing team. Ever notice how in every Warhammer setting, Chaos, or for the fantasy ones, the undead just don't need to give a shit about dying? Well, that's no longer unique to them. The good guys finally have their own respawn method. There's no need to worry about never seeing your friends again. Tommy got beheaded last week, and now he's in the cafeteria waiting to show you the cool cup he made out of his own skull. I mean, sure, the process is flawed, and the Stormcast lose a bit of their soul each time, and by the second death they start to lose their memories and personalities too, but I mean, what are you gonna do? You already get a free revive, plus the first one doesn't hurt you enough to really matter. In fact, since Sigmar pulls you from the moment you'd otherwise get murdered to become a Stormcast, you technically get 2 consequence-free revives. Plus old Siggy's trying to fix it, it's just hard, you know? He's a war god, he likes to smash shit and be done with the issue. Even if the process has issues, he's still doing way more than the Emperor did for any of his followers. And as far as being a factional wargame goes, the downsides like that are nearly irrelevant. When your guys get their shit pushed in because you don't know what you're doing in the slightest, narratively they just come right back and it's like you never lost the battle. Just, you know, now they're a little bit more schizophrenic than the first time around. They also show up to fights in the most metal way possible. An entire army suddenly appears from a massive lightning storm. Warhammer Fantasy has always been about a somewhat grounded fantasy universe. The Empire of Man's biggest problems, aside from the occasional continent-wide Viking invasion, were mostly mundane ones any early modern civilization had. All of the quarrels between elf and dwarf were grounded in historical grievances, very much like real-life cultures. That being said, the Stormcast are a walking power metal album and it's amazing. Absolutely nothing about them is grounded in reality, and it's goddamn awesome. An angry god throws lightning bolts onto the battlefield that causes an army of superhumans to show up and wreck your shit. Peak army material right there. So if you want your fantasy army to feel fantastical, then here you go. The Stormcast also brings a visual identity to Age of Sigmar that Warhammer Fantasy kinda lacked. Now I'll be honest, I prefer the setting of fantasy to that of AOS, but from a visual perspective, as opposed to a scent perspective, what the hell, come on. It didn't really have something that someone from an outside perspective could see and instantly go, yeah, that's Warhammer. Like, the Empire of Man is awesome, but if you weren't into Warhammer, then looking at an Imperial soldier, you wouldn't go, oh cool, that's that Warhammer thing I heard about. You might go, hey neat, some cool little Renaissance army dude. Even the more fantastical elements didn't really bring too much unique to the table, visually speaking that is. Sure, I love the high elves, but elves are in every goddamn fantasy setting, and visually they just look like elves. Awesome, but nothing unique to Warhammer. I mean, I guess they have the dildo helmets, but I don't know if I want to give them credit for that. But the Stormcast? Yeah, you look at them and go, this is Warhammer. You know what else Sigmar's Golden Boys have going for them? Basically unlimited homebrew capability. Want to make your own paint scheme and lore for a host of Stormcast? It's easy as hell. These guys are the Stoneforged Avengers. They come from Kamon and especially despise orcs. Also, they're all dwarfs. I made that up in 30 seconds, and ta-da, I now have the idea for an entire batch of Stormcast. Literally anything you think of can be a Stormcast, as long as it fulfills the two requirements of love Sigmar and hate chaos. There's no restrictions on gender or even species to be a Stormcast. Even the Space Marines aren't that flexible for building an original army. Relatedly, the models are also incredibly easy to paint. Large and relatively undetailed areas to paint make for a newcomer's best friend. Or any painter's best friend when you've spent 50 hours painting Eldar and have 6 models to show for it. I'm not bitter and projecting, you are. That's not to say they don't have the more detailed models. I mean, this guy sure has a lot going on. But the Stormcast models are certainly made to be given quick and easy color schemes. Plus, the main coloration for a lot of these guys, including the most commonly shown host, is a metallic color. Metallic paints, in my experience, are some of the easiest ones to use. So not only are the painted areas large and easily distinguishable from one another, you'll probably be using a paint that itself doesn't require insane painting skills to use. Speaking of their models, these things are gorgeous. Now, admittedly, I personally just like that thing when a character has a face mask like this. I just find it really cool. But even beyond that, some of these models are just awesome. I mean, look at Karl Franz the Celestin Prime. Now, there's a guy who's gonna bust some goddamn heads. Those thin metallic wings look pretty awesome too, and fit in with the armor itself so you don't just have someone in futuristic armor with angel wings awkwardly bolted on. Sanguinius. These guys are riding baby hippogriffs made out of lightning magic. Stormcast models bring a level of flair that previously Warhammer Fantasy never really had. Know whether or not you think that's a good thing admittedly comes down to personal preference, but for me, I'm putting it down in the positives. They're lightning-wielding demigods the size of a Prius and they look the part. I love that shit. That being said, you can give your models regular heads if you aren't a fan of the face mask look. Hell, with the flexibility they have, give them dwarf heads or orc heads too, why not? The point is, if you dislike how the models currently look, it's easy to change them up a little bit. If nothing else, I advise you to look up some images of some homebrew Stormcast paint jobs if you really dislike the high fantasy look they have going for them. With some more muted metallic colors instead of the standard aggressively golden look, the Stormcast really take on a whole new life. At the very least, the models themselves are objectively good quality. I haven't looked at all of them, but I've looked at a few dozen of the available ones and I haven't seen any resin models yet. None of the models look derpy because of aging or poor sculpting either. They're an incredibly new army in the grand scale of Warhammer, so this does make sense. To compare, look at the Beastmen or Skaven, who've been around for a lot longer, so you can tell they're suffering in that department. How about their rules? What's the upside of the Stormcast? Well, first off, they have one of the highest number of available models for an army in either Warhammer setting. This means you have a massive amount of options to choose from, giving the Stormcast a pretty damn impressive level of flexibility on the battlefield. They've got some range, they've got some magic, they've got a lot of big burly bastards ready to smack someone's head down through their ribcage. You'll have at least something in just about every department. Plus, they can ally with other Order factions if there's a specific weakness you think another army can patch up nicely. From half-naked elves to angry dinosaurs to a tank, you can bring in your allies to show that Sigmar doesn't discriminate. He takes help from all those who are willing to give it. As for the Stormcast themselves, they've got some pretty solid stats. They are highly durable soldiers. They have ways to heal lost wounds, but that's assuming you lose any wounds, because Stormcast models all have 2 wounds or more and a 4-up save. If you have no idea what that means, don't worry, I barely do either. In normal people words, the Stormcast are hard to hurt, and if you do hurt them, they can heal up pretty easily. Stormcast models also hit pretty hard. Now, of course, some armies hit a bit harder. I mean, the followers of the Blood God are probably going to be pretty damn good at gathering blood, but it's safe to say that when the Stormcast reach the melee, they're going to be dishing out some damage themselves. In fact, they're pretty decent all-rounders. They've got some shooting, they've got some wizards, they got some dope as hell cavalry. From what I've seen, all of these units perform, if not great, then at least adequately. Are some models going to underperform relative to their cost? Yeah, of course. But again, from what I've seen, there's no models that are more or less objectively bad choices to take, just some that could be tweaked a bit. I know the rules part of this video is going to be a bit short, but honestly, there's only so much I can say before I start getting into a level of detail I don't really want to take the do or don't series to. The Stormcast hit hard, can take a beating, and have plenty of options available between the army itself and other Order factions. Now, usually I'd get into the lore downsides of these guys at this point in the video, but there's something so divisive, so hit or miss that I can't bring myself to put in either positive or negative, so I'm just going to awkwardly put it in the middle. The Stormcast Eternals are Warhammer Fantasy Space Marines. They're big, tough models that hit hard, they have a massive amount of options to choose from, and clearly get a bit more love from Games Workshop than some other factions. They're easy to paint and build to appeal to new players. When GW unveiled these guys, it's pretty clear what inspired them. Now, this can be good and bad. For the good, it gives the fantasy settings of Warhammer something a bit more fantastical. Something that really makes the setting feel like it's a unique and crazy world where even the good guys are surrounded by magic to help them in battle. It gives Age of Sigmar an easy armor for people who want to get into the hobby, which in turn brings more people into the hobby since they don't need to assemble and paint an army with 1,000 different fiddly bits. I mean, the first models I ever painted were some clipped together Stormcast ones. It gives the good guys of fantasy an ultimate weapon to turn to. Plus, Space Marines are cool, so it's not the worst crime to try and recreate them in a different setting. But it also brings negatives. Warhammer Fantasy was always a more down-to-earth setting where the forces of evil were pushed back by everyday men and women using what they had, from the Empire using pike and shot formation to the High Elves consisting largely of trained militia forces. True, the villains were demons from hell and rats with energy weapons, but the heroes usually were more realistic even if they were members of fantasy races. So when the Stormcast come in like, we are the chosen of a god emperor who has built an army of super soldiers to reclaim lost lands, it can feel like GW wanted to make some easy money and not a natural progression of the established setting. It can also be seen as GW kind of watering down their settings a bit. Need something to revive the fantasy setting? Space Marines, of course. Need a new release? Fuck it, one of the Space Marines. I don't care if it's the sci-fi or fantasy ones. They can be seen as GW making yet another bland and generic army to play it safe and marketable with, rather than trying to come up with something unique and truly interesting. Plus, with the whole soul-stealing thing that happens when they die, it can be argued that what little originality they have is being taken away to make them more like Space Marines, with the Stormcast becoming more emotionless and detached from humanity the more often they die. Now, I personally love the Stormcast, but I understand why people might look at them and go, this is stupid, they're just fantasy Space Marines. Here's how I look at it, and by that, of course, I mean how Josh Reynolds put it, and I'm shamelessly plagiarizing. The Space Marines are Batman, and the Stormcast are Captain America. They both beat the snot out of bad guys, they're both superheroes, but you wouldn't call Captain America and Batman the same thing, now would you? Anyways, weird divisive topic over, time for negatives. Lore-wise, the Stormcast are getting the shit kicked out of them lately. Entire storm hosts are being severely damaged, if not outright destroyed. Sigmar are still desperately trying to fix the issue with recreating them when they die. The Lumineth are stealing their thunder. And becoming the faction that swoops in out of nowhere to save the day. Not a great time to be a Sigmarine. Of course, that issue can come and go with the lore releases. What can't come and go is the fact that the Stormcast, while they don't permanently die, certainly suffer from it. I've mentioned it already, but to go into full detail on it, when a Stormcast dies, their soul travels back to Sigmar so we can remake them a new body and send them back out. Problem is, every time one dies, the god of death Nagash sticks his bony fingers in the Stormcast soul and steals a bit because he's an asshole like that. Just reaches on in and yanks some soul juice away. So Sigmar can't properly recreate them as they were, and the more times they die, the more emotionless and detached they become, along with them losing their memory as well. So yeah, sure, they'll always come back, but eventually the Stormcast might become an army of fleshy Necrons. Just something to keep in mind if you wanted an army of pure good super soldiers, because that pure good thing is slowly going away. Lore-wise, they're also always in the biggest of battles. While at first this might seem like an upside, it takes away a little bit of relatability. Like, I can't imagine myself swinging a hammer the size of a man in a lava field the size of Manhattan fighting millions of slaves of dark gods. But I sure as shit can imagine myself sitting next to a cannon absolutely terrified while a few dozen beastmen come charging at my fort. Not the biggest downside, but just something to keep in mind if, like me, you enjoy a more scaled down narrative from time to time. The Stormcast really don't get those. As for their models, like I said, I think they look good and are as a whole very creative, but from unit to unit, you aren't getting much variety. Big dude in gold armor. Big dude in gold armor. Big girl in slightly fancier golden armor. Big dude in gold armor on a circumcised dragon. Yeah, you could really see that they're just fantasy Space Marines here. As for rules negatives, here are a few. First off, you get your rules first out of everyone. Now, this might sound like a purely positive thing, but keep in mind that usually means that when a new edition first launches, the Stormcast have had the least amount of time to get to grips with it. Whereas other factions might have well over a year of GW observing games to see how certain mechanics work and fit together, the Stormcast have whatever testing Games Workshop did during development, and that's it. Their rules age more than any other faction, for better or worse. On top of that, because their rules come first, everyone everyone knows how they work first. By the time most other armies get their own battle tome, they know what the Stormcast are gonna do. This leads to other factions having something in their list specifically to counter Stormcast because everyone's had time to figure out how to do it. It's the same as the Space Marines in 40k. Because they're so common and updated first, everyone has something to specifically handle them. Unlike the Space Marines though, you aren't quite as favored by GW. The Stormcasts are certainly the favorite, don't get me wrong, but not like the Space Marines getting one model every time any other faction does, so half of all releases are Space Marine. Other factions are allowed to have fun in Age of Sigmar, which is definitely a positive for the setting as a whole, but if you choose Stormcast, don't expect Games Workshop to be on their knees worshipping your faction. It's more like $10 extra in your allowance because you're the favorite child, but your parents don't want to make it obvious. Also, you will get sick of the names for them very quickly. You know the Space Wolves, the wolfiest wolves to ever wolf, the enemies of the Wolf Emperor Wolf of Wolf Wolf? That's the Stormcast, just replace the word wolf with storm or some equivalent. The Stormcast Eternals are organized into Storm Host and can also garrison Storm Keeps. The words storm and associated words like thunder are going to show up everywhere. If not, then you get these things: Desolator, Justicator, Fulminator, Evocator, Prestidigitator. Do I know what any of these words mean? No. Does Games Workshop? Probably not. It sure is stupid though, and it doesn't even tell you what those models do. What the fuck is a fulminator gonna do? What does it mean to be fulminated? Why do I have to pull out a dictionary every time I look at your web store, Games Workshop? Why don't you fulminate some bitches? Now for rules, what shits the bed for the Stormcast? Well, your soldiers being super comes at a literal price. For every model you can field, just assume the enemy has two. Unless you're playing against ogres or the Gargants, you're probably going to be outnumbered. Depending on how you set up your army, there are rules that allow a single Stormcast model to count as 2 or 3 for the purpose of holding objectives, but even that might not help. It doesn't matter if your unit of 5 Prestidigitators counts as 15, I'm throwing 40 Clanarts on that objective and I'm not letting go. Another issue is that also unlike the Space Marines, you aren't the jack of all trades, also the master of everything, because fuck you, this is Space Marine 40k. You're good at everything, don't get me wrong, but you don't really excel at anything compared to a faction who specializes in it. Khorne is going to butcher you in a stand-up fight. If you try and get in a shooting match with the Kharadron Overlords, you're going to end up looking like the first guy to get off the boat on Normandy. You have to use your all-rounder status to make the most out of the Stormcast, because while you can brute force your way to victory to some extent, you aren't good enough at it to do it all the time. Also, given that they're closer to the elite end of the spectrum, every model you lose is going to hurt. It's not as bad as the Gargants, you know, the army that might have 2 models in it, but compare the Stormcast to a unit of skeletons. Oh, half the unit got wiped? What am I ever going to do without those units that exist to die so something else gets to live? Yeah, you don't get that luxury. Every loss noticeably hurts. If your units don't get stuck in and they die, you've wasted your points. So, there's my basic guide of the Stormcast. Elite units who aren't great at everything, but still good enough to fight in Sigmar's name, even if the odds against them stack higher and higher. I hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching, and take care.